Large-scale agriculture is what we are most familiar with, and we all know what it looks like. Here, I want to spend a few minutes highlighting some important concepts from the chapter you have read, the chapter 5, Subsistence. We tend to think of large-scale agriculture as a progress and as a wonderful innovation, but anthropologists have questioned whether this is really so. Large-scale agriculture has advantages and disadvantages. Among the latter is environmental degradation, when toxic chemicals in fertilizers and pesticides are used for more intensive cultivation. Another important disadvantage, as the chapter says on page 111, is its tendency to create wealth differences. Compared to hunter-gatherers or to pastoralist societies that are more egalitarian and where land is generally not privately owned, agricultural societies often see a division between landowners and landless people or groups who control the land and those who do not. In many societies today, this translates also into powerful corporations owning large agricultural lands. Another interesting aspect to consider is that although agriculture produces large quantities of food, this does not necessarily lead to food security for all the people who are living in a country or in a society, or more generally for the world population. An important reason for this is that food is not necessarily redistributed in a way that promotes equality and food justice. To summarize some of the negative aspects of agriculture, the textbook chapter that you have read on page 111 notes that agricultural societies were among the first to utilize enslaved and indentured labor. Another quote from the same page 111 reminds us that agriculture created conditions that led to the expansion of social inequality, violent conflict between communities, and environmental degradation. Now, if you think back to the article that we read in this course in the first week, the article on growing and eating bugs, anthropologists like Mackenzie Wade ask, what are the contexts for food production? What are the requirements and results of different food systems? And how do they go together with our ideas of what constitutes food? How do they perhaps challenge or strengthen the value that we place on particular foods? As you see here in this image that was part of that article by Mackenzie Wade, she explained that the animal products that we usually eat in North America are part of an industrial food system characterized in part by biodiversity loss, land degradation, chemical use, waste production, and greenhouse gas emissions. And these are the words of Mackenzie Wade from that article from week 1. These are important reasons why several organizations are promoting insects as a source of more sustainable proteins. Of course, as an anthropologist, Mackenzie is very interested in how culture is inevitably part of that, because it tells us what counts and what does not count as food, and even what tastes and smells good, and what we perceive to be disgusting. All of this depending on the societies and culture we grew up in and a part of. Looking at subsistence and the production of food in different societies also brought anthropologists to pay attention to how foods, but also other resources are exchanged and distributed in society, including money barter and gift exchange. And what I want to talk about here is different forms of reciprocity. Anthropologists talk about at least 3 different kinds of reciprocity, and they are generalized reciprocity, balanced reciprocity, and negative reciprocity. Let's start from the first one, generalized reciprocity. So what is it? Generalized reciprocity is an exchange of goods, of foods, of gifts, of services, where the person's giving and the person receiving do not keep track or keep a list of things, so to speak. So they do not keep an exact ledger of the value of what they exchange, and they don't know exactly when they will receive something in return. That's why it has the name of generalized reciprocity, because the idea is that over time, the giving and the receiving will balance itself out. This is a form of exchange that exists in all societies, and certainly it also has an importance in our lives. But anthropologists have also been interested in it because it plays a very significant role in hunter-gatherer societies in particular, but also in pastoral societies, for example, and it plays a role in how food is distributed and in the system of making a living. So, for example, in hunter-gatherer societies, if a hunter hunts a large prey and has access to meat, then it is expected that that food will be shared in the community. And again, there is no exact ledger or exact list being kept, but people know that once another hunter gets some meat as well, that meat will also be shared. And so it kind of goes around until over time things balance themselves out. The advantage of this is that everybody has access to, in this case, meat that is hunted in a community, and nobody will really go hungry, that food is distributed. It also, of course, strengthens egalitarianism because nobody can hoard food and everybody's expected to share so that everybody has a similar access to food. So very important for hunter-gatherer societies. Hutchinson also described something like that happening in pastoralist societies and in Nuer in particular. So she said that traditionally Nuers wouldn't go for journeys bringing food with them because it was expected that they will be fed. It was expected that people would share food and any traveler would be able to eat food. Again, with the idea that over time this will balance itself out. Similarly, she describes how men in our Nuer community would be able to eat in different households and be fed in different families because, again, food is supposed to be shared. It's something that people share. So again, strengthening egalitarianism and strengthening also food security and access to food. When we think of generalized reciprocity, it's also something that we can imagine is part of general hospitality. I invite you for my birthday cake, and I know when you have a birthday, you will invite me, and I will eat cake there too. Other things like perhaps sharing surplus garden produce or swapping plums for apples if neighbors have gardens and that kind of thing. That is all under the thinking of generalized reciprocity. Other two kinds of reciprocity that anthropologists have studied are balanced reciprocity and negative reciprocity. And I mentioned these types of exchanges here also because you will find they are important in the book Made in Madagascar and what Walsh describes. So balanced reciprocity is a more direct exchange. So the idea is that the person who receives something will return within a particular time limit goods or food or services that are quite, that are of similar value of what has been received. And the most, the easiest way to think about it is gift exchanges, right? And a simple barter transaction, kids when they swap toys, or neighbors if they swap babysitting, or different rides to school or things like that. And part of this is that we are thinking of things that are traded in exchange that are of equal value. There might be gifts, but then if some persons continue to give something that of lesser value than the other, then that will likely result in hurt feelings, and it will likely result in people not engaging in this kind of reciprocity anymore. And another reciprocity, and again, I mention it here because you will think about it in Walsh, is negative reciprocity. And negative reciprocity is when something starts as a reciprocity of one kind or another, either generalized or balanced, but then one of the participants actually takes advantage of the other and attempts to get something without returning it. And this, of course, also happens in all society, and is important to keep in mind as well. Now, I would like you to think for a minute of some example that you might find of this kind of reciprocity in your life. What could be generalized and balanced reciprocity in your everyday life? And if you think particularly about food and making a living, what role does it play in how perhaps we distribute food items in our society? Perhaps you have access to a garden and have given or received some tomatoes or fresh greens or mint or basil. Or perhaps you have prepared a meal for a friend who's sick and you know that you could expect some help if you're not feeling later on. This is not in regards to food, but perhaps you have swapped clothes or taken a book from one of the little free libraries. What kind of reciprocity is this? And how does it help us understand how goods, resources, or food circulates in society? Earlier in the lecture segment, I mentioned the community fridge and the paid-forward coffee system in Costa Rica that Karen Stocker talks about. She mentions the habit of buying coffee for people who perhaps come after you in a coffee shop but might not be able to afford it. So what kind of reciprocity is that? How could you describe it? As a form of general reciprocity, these are forms of giving and receiving without the expectation of direct and immediate receiving or immediate giving. So it is not a direct exchange. As a system that circulates food, it is meant to strengthen community and contribute to systems of food security. A very interesting example of exchange and of a trading system that fascinated early anthropologists is the Kula ring in the Trobriand Islands. I want to talk a little bit more about the Kula because it is something you are probably not familiar with and shows some of the complex relations between subsistence, trading, reciprocity, ritual, and worldview. You may remember Malinowski from an earlier lecture on fieldwork and about participant observation. He is the one that was doing fieldwork in the Trobriand Island and who helped to bring the method of participant observation in the discipline. So when he did fieldwork in the early 1900s in the Trobriand Island, Malinowski encountered the practice of the Kula. And when he did so, he was facing something that looked like a trading system. To say it simply, the Kula ring, and here is a map of it that you can see. The Kula ring is an exchange of shell bracelets and necklaces that pass in opposite directions among a ring of islands. And here you see the ring of islands and the movement that these shell bracelets and necklaces travel in. And the Trobriand Islanders and people from neighboring islands are fisher people and horticulturalists. If you remember, horticulturalists means that they have gardens. They grow yams and taro, among other things. They also raise pigs, and of course, they also fish. When trading partners meet in this Kula exchange by traveling between islands, they exchange shell necklaces for shell bracelets. They also exchange everyday commodities like pigs, fish, yams, and boats. So while at first sight, the Kula looks like people traveling from island to island, trading ordinary goods, as well as exchanging bracelets and necklaces, there are also many surprising things to them. And here is an excerpt of an article that Malinowski wrote in 1920, so 100 years ago. He writes that, first of all, the object of exchange, so the arm shells and the strings of shell discs that are exchanged, so the bracelets and the necklaces, are not utilities in any sense of a word. So they are not useful in anything. They are hardly ever used as ornaments for which purposes they could serve. So they are not even used as jewelry. Nevertheless, they are extremely highly valued, which is something surprising considering, first of all, they don't serve to do anything, and they are not even used as jewelry, which, we could imagine they would be used at. The second thing that is quite surprising is that the exchange is carried on according to very definite and very complex rules. Thus, it cannot be performed between members at random. A firm and lifelong relationship is always established between any participant in the Kula and a number of other men, some of whom belong to his own community and others to overseas communities. Such men call one another karaitau, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but such men call one another partner, as we shall designate them, and they are under mutual obligations to trade with each other, to offer protection, hospitality, and assistance whenever needed. So it's not just, again, a random exchange. When the people meet and exchange food and other resources, they also exchange these necklaces and arm shells, but they do that in the context of a long, trusting relationship that includes a responsibility to offer protection, hospitality, and things like that. And Malinowski helped us imagine what it actually looks like to one participating in the Kula ring in this system. So he writes, let us imagine that we look at the whole system from one definite point, so perhaps from one island of one village. for example, from the large village of Sinakita in the Trobriand Island. An old chief in that village would have, say, some 100 partners southwards, and about as many again to the north and east, while a young commoner would only have a few on both sides. And here, of course, it matters who the traders are, how long they have been in the Kula, what is the status, the power, their accrued connections. It must be remembered that not all men in the village take part in the Kula, and that some villages are out of it altogether. Let us suppose that I, a Sinakita man, I am in possession of a pair of big arm shells. An overseas expedition from Bobu in the Entrecasco archipelago arrives at my village. Blowing a conch shell, I take my arm shell pair and I offer it to my overseas partner with some such words. This is an initial gift, and in due time, you return to me a big necklace for it. Next year, when I visit my partner's village, he either is in possession of an equivalent necklace, and this, he gives it to me as a restoration gift, or he doesn't have yet a necklace that is good enough to repay my last gift. And in this case, he will give me a smaller necklace and will give it to me as an intermediary gift. So this means that the main gift has to be repaid on a future occasion, and this intermediate gift is given in token of good faith, but in turn must be repaid by me in the meantime by a gift of small arm shells. The final gift, which will be given to me to conclude the whole transaction, would then be called a kudu, an equivalent gift, in a contrast to pasi. So this is certainly quite a complicated system, right? And thinking about this description that Malinowski gives of it, which aspects are particularly interesting in this inter-island exchange system? Well, first of all, if we look at the Kula as a simple exchanging of goods, we would be missing key points. If we look at it as a ritualized gift giving, we also may not notice how everyday food items and resources are exchanged as part of it. The social position of people involved in the Kula is very important. And it is fascinating how people follow the history of particular objects over years. These objects do not have a particular use or utility, but are rather prized for their beauty, their history, and for their circulating movements in a living system. The Kula is also a very good reminder that when anthropologists learn about the society, they cannot separate one aspect from the other, but instead they have to look at how different parts, ideas, practices, or characteristics of the culture relate to one another. This is something that anthropologists call holism, looking at different aspects of a society or a culture in all of its different parts and different aspects. The Kula is an exchange of food items, and as such, it is tied to garden and horticultural rhythms. It is tied to fishing and other subsistence activities. But it is also a very complex gift-giving system that connects faraway islands and extends through time. It literally sustains relationships across time and space. It has gender component, as you have seen. It is men who participate in it, and it is a way to obtain status and prestige. It includes elaborate rituals, and it is linked to particular ways of understanding the world, the land, the sea, yams and fish, and social relations between people and communities. To look at these aspects, anthropologists need to adopt a cultural relativist standpoint to see how all these elements make sense in a particular society and how they change through time. And of course, change through time is also very important because what we have read here is 100 years old. It is a description of the Kula from Malinowski. But I think it's important to look at it as an example of different aspects of the society being connected, and also how ways of making a living and subsistence then are linked to exchange and reciprocity, social relations, and here even rituals and worldview. Going back to Walsh and native Madagascar, what are some of the ways in which different people make a living in Ankarana? What can you say? What can you remember about that? How does Walsh need to look at many different yet always interconnected aspects? This can include various ideas and uses of space. It includes a relationship between many different people like traders, miners, tourists, elders, and farmers. It can include rituals like the one of going into the caves and different ways of making a good life.